memory. We have André Aciman, Claudia Roden in conversation with Karima Khalil. So let's welcome André Aciman, Claudia Roden, and Karima Khalil on stage for the session, Alexandria, City of Memory. More will come, more will come. Just start.
Told me she's from Alexandria.
Well, that's lovely. She is? Yeah. She's from Cairo.
Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here in Jaipur again. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Claudia Roden and André Aciman. As many of you know, Claudia Roden is the doyenne or the I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for? No, the queen of Middle Eastern cooking. You've been referred to as the one-woman cultural bridge between Middle Eastern cooking and the West. But Claudia is often called a cultural anthropologist. She's an author of more than 10 books on Middle Eastern cooking and Mediterranean cooking. And I'm absolutely delighted to be with her this afternoon. André Aciman is a distinguished professor at the City University of New York in comparative literature and is an expert on Proust and is born in Alexandria, Egypt. Claudia is born in Cairo, and I'm from Alexandria as well, so that's why we are all three on this stage together this afternoon. We're going to talk about Alexandria, and maybe one thing that we might start with is that there are actually many different Alexandrias. That is because Alexandria is such a mosaic, it's such a composite or such a jigsaw of many different nationalities. At least it was so in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And I think maybe we might start with Claudia to talk a little bit about what kind of a mosaic it was.
Yes, well, it was the same mosaic as in Cairo, but different. Egypt in my time was a cosmopolitan, multicultural society with many minorities, Greek, Syrian, Armenian, from most of the Mediterranean. Italians were all there. And of course a Jewish community, of which I am. And the Jewish community itself, I found later, was a mosaic of people that had come from all over the old Ottoman Empire. And it was when the Suez Canal was built that it was always a great port city, but with the building of the canal, it became the most important city in the Mediterranean. And so people came certainly from many countries where their trade ended because, for instance, in Aleppo, where they were on the Silk route, on the spice trade route, and but they all then started coming through Alexandria.
And André, you have been quoted many times as saying that you think of Alexandria every day.
I've said that, yes.
Okay. Why have you said that? Or why do you think about Alexandria every day? Why Alexandria?
The fact is that when you are displaced from your home place or home city or even homeland, you are not obsessed by it, which means that you think of it every day, but what you do find yourself doing is constantly finding correspondences wherever you are in the world, even if you never leave the new city that you're living in, you always find yourself saying, ah, this corner reminds me of that. That flavor reminds me of something else in my childhood. That kind of sneeze, because sneezes are cultural, this way of sneezing or of smiling reminds me of Egypt. So you do it all the time, not just once a day. You do it constantly. And it's a way of rebuilding not just your identity, but rebuilding a sense of selfhood hinged on a new place. And so you're constantly saying, okay, I'm finding the same street, I'm finding the same house, this looks like that, I'm at home. And then you realize, of course, that you're entirely mistaken, that you're not at home. This is not your home. This is just Erzat's home.
An ersatz home. Well, to take a step backwards, I should have mentioned at the beginning that both of you left Egypt at roughly the same time in your lives. André, you left when you were 14 in 1964. And Claudia, you left initially in 1952 to go to boarding school in France when you were 15. In 1952. Yeah. And you kept on going backwards and forwards for a bit until your family was forced out of Egypt in 1956, as well as André's was in 1964. So it seems to me that for both of you, the being forced to leave Egypt and the expulsion of your families really very largely shaped the trajectory that your lives took, at least in those initial years. Would you like to speak to that, Claudia?
Yes,
first?
I think it changed the trajectory completely. And yes, it was very traumatic at the time when it happened, but as a young person, you're not affected as older people who have lived and worked to build up a company, to buy a house, and they have to leave it behind. As young people, we thought, oh, well, we're in England. We were happy to be in Britain, and we were allowed to stay because from being an art student, I became an asylum seeker. We had to ask to be allowed to stay, and a lot of people who came out at the same time weren't allowed, and so they just spread all over the world.
And what did that drive you to do when you initially were an art student at St. Martin's, and then you took a job when your parents joined you? And what I understand from your writing and from interviews is that a lot of people, as you say, were coming through your house all the time, others who had been forced to leave Egypt or to leave other parts in the Mediterranean. Yeah. And you would all sit around and you would talk about...
Yes. I mean, I think I had about 10 years of my life. I felt that I had left Egypt to go to art school, but suddenly Egypt came, and I just was in Egypt because all the people, because my parents had, all their relatives, we have a very, very big extended family, and they were either staying in London, but a lot of them just passing through London. And so we were part of them for 10 years, maybe 15 years. And during that time, I realized how people were asking for recipes because we didn't have cookbooks and there were no printed recipes. They just weren't there. And because as a community, we were from Greece, from Turkey, in my case, from Syria. We all had different recipes. And suddenly people were saying to each other, give me your recipe for so-and-so. I'll never see you again. It'll be something to remember you by. And so I just started collecting recipes. I started collecting for us because I thought, if, this is one of the things we can take with us. We can't take anything else that was happy about our lives there. But this certainly was. And I was just collecting and collecting for many years. And people were telling me, this recipe is from Izmir. This recipe is from Salonika. Well, my parents came from Baghdad. So I was suddenly having all these recipes all from different places. But that also made me want to go further and see why, what actually came from where. And a lot of people had the same. They said, this is Greek, baklava, this is Turkish, this is from Iran. And so it made me interested in the history of food.
But Claudia, is it not true that you became something of a detective? I mean, you became sort of obsessive about finding recipes, and you went to great lengths to find them, and you did all kinds of odd, I mean, you found them in all kinds of odd ways. You spoke in one place of going and sitting in the Iranian consulate to find Iranian women to ask them Iranian recipes. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, because I became really an obsessive collector, that I had one thing in mind, is just to get more recipes and good ones. I was trying them. But yes, I would do the kind of thing like go to the Iranian embassy, and they would say, have you come, in those days it was easy to go in, have you come for a visa? I said, no, I've come to collect recipes, to meet people. And actually there were people there, and they invited me to dinner. And so, I've got a lot of papers with different people's handwriting as well. And I would go, for instance, to the docks where Iraqis sell carpets. They sell Persian carpets or something. And I would go and they say, do you want a carpet? And I said, no, can I meet your wives? Because your wives are going to give recipes. But so it became also for me a fun thing. So who will I find next? Where do I go? Yes, the whole search was a fun thing.
Andre, would you like to tell us a bit about how, I mean, obviously you wrote out of Egypt, and that grew out of clearly was your reworking of your memories of Alexandria and your memories of Egypt. But would you like to describe to us a little bit how that expulsion from Egypt when you were 14 shaped the years of your life that followed?
Well, maybe there has to be a distinction made between people who choose exile or are basically expatriates, as Fitzgerald, Hemingway, whatever. James Joyce was a determined expatriate from Dublin. And then there are people who do it because it was not their choice. They are not exiles. They're more or less expelled individuals. And they carry different burdens. One is occasionally nostalgic, homesick, whatever. The other has the added onus of feeling that not only have you been expelled, but you're not allowed to even go back. So there is a truncation in the back of you. Something has been cut off and you can never get it again. So one is a sort of voluntarily leaving, the other is completely involuntary. And so there's a curse on you. And you live with that. So you're constantly trying to resolve this expulsion that has been foisted on you. And I think that most of the people, there's been a slew of memoirs from Iraq, from Iran, mostly, and from Egypt, of course, mostly by Jews who have lost everything and were kicked out from their homelands, and who are feeling that the only thing they can do in order to resettle themselves is to do it on paper. So that I have found that everything I do in order to find a new home basically means that I have to have done it through paper, by being a writer, by writing about the exilic condition, if you want to use a ridiculous term. Okay, and there are people who have now created what are known in universities, please don't laugh, exilic studies. Okay, it is a subject of humor. Okay, but this is the experience that you have is essentially you're living with this sense of, I didn't choose to leave this place. I may not have liked it, and I didn't like Egypt growing up in Egypt, but it was my home. There was no question about that. So once you're forced out, you find yourself in the paradoxical condition of feeling homesick for a place that you were never in love with to begin with. It gets worse. And I've written about this because when I think back of Egypt, I find myself, I don't want to be back in Egypt. This is the funny thing. But what I want to do is to go back to my home in Egypt, where I would sit at a window with my aunt, and we would look out at the sea, and she would say, you know, this vision of the sea reminds me of my house in Paris, where you look out and you see the Seine. And basically what I want to do is I want to go back to Egypt to be in a position to look out at the Europe that I was already looking forward to discover when I was in Egypt. So there is no home any longer of any kind. There's only the transit between the imagined home, the remembered home, and of course, the real home, which becomes a bubble of nothing.
You have said displacement becomes the tangible home.
I'm sorry?
Displacement becomes the tangible home.
Yes, displacement. The experience of displacement is, in fact, the only real thing you know. You don't like being displaced. Nobody likes to be displaced.
I like it.
You do? Do you seriously?
Yes, because it makes me feel international.
Oh, well.
Where now we're supposed to be national in England.
Well, what displacement has done to me, it has cut me off from any nationality. So I have no allegiance to any flag, to any nation. I certainly don't believe in any religion because my father converted to a Protestant religion thinking it was going to help his stay in Egypt. It did not. He was still Jewish. So I didn't believe in Judaism. I didn't believe in Protestantism. I studied Quranic studies in school in order to better my Arabic because my Arabic was dreadful. I didn't know how to read classical Arabic. So in essence, I've been exposed to all the religions and I don't want any of them. There's nothing. So I have you become entirely displaced, which is, I mean, yes, being displaced has allowed me to become the author I am. But I've become the author I am because I'm trying to resolve displacement.
So, Claudia, I mean, talking about where you feel at home, you've also been quoted, I mean, as saying that now you live in London, you missed Egypt for many years, you perhaps don't miss it so much anymore as it has gone distant in time, but that wherever you are in the Mediterranean, when you travel in the Mediterranean, you feel at home. So
Yes.
why is that?
And this is it. I did miss Egypt and I did love my life in Egypt. I did feel I had a happy life. But I did leave early before things turned sour, long before André. And so I would have had a different experience then. But also the country that was Egypt is not the same one now. It was, because of all these minorities, it was a country that actually French was the lingua franca. People blame us for having spoken French, and some people have told me, you were thrown out of Egypt because you spoke French. But all the Muslims that we knew spoke French as well, and they weren't thrown out. And some of us told us they wish they had been thrown out, because in fact our lives have turned out for the better by being away. But I do feel when I go back to Egypt the first time after 30 years, I was overcome with affection for the country. And because, you know, to have the smells that I knew, to feel the air that I knew, it's all that I saw was derelict. Where I lived became derelict. It was so covered in soot and all that. And then where we used to have cafe at the Americaine, I found a hand on a wall that had not been a painted hand by mistake, by a painter, that hadn't been repainted over. But I just felt happy and emotional. And also, I did meet people because the first time I went, I was there to write. I was asked by the Observer magazine to write about what it's like coming back and what it was like. So I was trying to meet a lot of people. It gave me something to do. If I hadn't had something to do, I might have been sad because I was going around the area where I lived, which was Zamalek, and I suddenly could see images of my aunt at a window. At another window, I just thought, will they be coming out? This unbelievable feeling of ghosts in a city where their presence was still there for me. But I then overcame it by talking to a lot of people. And I went to see, because I was actually that pocket of minority, which was a little minority, was the Jewish, but everybody else had their pocket, their culture that was going on, and we were also part of them because we met them at school, we met them at the club where we were all the time. Our parents, our father did business with them. So it was sort of, there was a fusion. And we were talking, we were speaking in many languages. We also spoke Italian at home as well. But I remember walking actually on that occasion in the street in Zamalek with an American woman who was there as a professor or something. And suddenly somebody passed speaking the French, Egyptian, Cairene or Alexandrian that I knew. And for me, I suddenly thought, wow. And then she said, I hate that ancien régime accent. Ancien régime. So I was the ancien régime. So I thought, you know, when you go away, you have many identities. But now I'm also ancien régime.
Claudia, you've told me, you've spoken to me of the longing and nostalgia that others you have met around the Mediterranean have for Egypt. And you were telling me about how this exists in Slovenia and how it's very strong, and came sort of as a surprise to you to find this sort of very strong streak of nostalgia for Egypt in Slovenia. Would you like to tell the audience a bit about that?
I feel I also have to say that when you asked before, I didn't answer you, but that because I research the whole Mediterranean, and whenever I've been to a port, you know, whether it is Genoa or any of the ports about the Mediterranean, I just feel at home. And I feel, here's Alexandria, something, because we did have holidays in Alexandria, and we were enthralled by Alexandria when we arrived by the sea. But there was this mix in all these cities that are also something about the culture of the Mediterranean, of the seaport, but also of the kind of people who are there and the way they behave and all that, that's familiar. But something that I think isn't often mentioned is the Slovene nannies. I don't know, André, if you had a Slovene nanny, but there was a big, I got an email through my agent from Slovenia saying you wrote a recipe for potica and you said it was from your nanny, or your nanny did a different dish, and your nanny was a Slovene Italian. Can you tell us about her? Because we are a group of women finding out about what happened to our grandmothers. Because nearly all the women, or at least in every single family, a woman had to go to Egypt, and they started going at the turn of the century. Also, when there was a big migration from Italy, from Trieste, when the Suez Canal was open. And so they came to Alexandria to work first for the Italians, and then it became a sort of, they came in a huge way to Alexandria and to Cairo. And for a lot of us, this is how we learnt Italian, because I think Italian was very much more spoken in Alexandria, and whereas my parents spoke French at home, in my aunt in Alexandria, Edith, she spoke Italian at home, but we learned from the nannies who came.
And you were telling me that they have some sort of Egyptian club or something in Slovenia,
Yes.
is that correct?
They are obsessed with Egypt now in Slovenia. And the thing is that for years, all the women who were still there, they all left at the same time as the Jews and the French and other people left. They left as well. And, but the women who went back were ostracized. And people just rejected them, which was very sad, partly because they left a family behind to send money home, but they weren't wanted back. But one thing that I heard was that somebody had written a novel about those women who went, that they were in a harem. And so the idea that their women were in a harem, and or else they were having affairs with Muslim men, they didn't want them back. But actually, all these women, as far as I knew, they just spent their whole life in church. Even on their day out, they were in church.
Andre, if I could come back to you for a minute. You've written in many different genres, and you write a lot about memory, and you write a lot about memories and about writing about memory. And you mentioned a phrase in one of your interviews that really caught my imagination. That was the overwriting of memory. And I wonder if you'd like to speak about that a little bit, how we sometimes might have a very complex and colorful memory of an incident, and once we've written it down and reduced it, it's difficult sometimes to capture the original memory. I don't know, if you would like to speak to that a bit.
Well, I think that everyone, and I'm sure everyone in this room, can sit down and write a memoir of their childhood and some of the madness of their families. I'm sure all your families are crazy anyway. A family is a dysfunctional unit to begin with. But you find that once you've written down an incident that occurred, suddenly from your memory banks, this incident filters through language and then becomes sort of solidified into a sentence or two sentences. And then the next thing you know, as happens with many pictures of your childhood, you remember yourself in the picture, but you don't remember where the picture was taken, who took the picture, who you were when this picture was taken, because the photograph has taken over your entire memory. Same thing happens with writing. Writing, once it is solidified on paper or on screen, what happens is that it takes over a reality of its own. And every time you want to remember a particular incident, the thing you wrote down suddenly surges in your mind and takes over every time you try, so that you really forget the incident itself. And I have an example of this because when I was writing one of my books, Out of Egypt, I had written down a walk that I took with my brother to go to the beach, to see the beach for the last night of my life, the beach of Alexandria. And as every Alexandrian would tell you, and every Cairene knows, the beaches of Alexandria, for all their filth, have always been the best beaches of our lives. And we used to go there every summer. And I took a walk with my brother to see the beach, and it's dark because it's also the first or second night of Ramadan. And it's suddenly that you can hear the cannon go, which means now you can eat. And there's an old Egyptian fellow who's basically cooking something on on a large sort of stand, and people are buying it in order to eat it. And he sees me looking at the thing, and he says, "Why don't you have one?" And he gives it to me for free. And here I am leaving Egypt, hating the fact that I'm leaving, but also looking forward to Europe. And suddenly this experience grounds me and says, "You're never going to forget this country. This is really your home, whatever they do to you." And so I walk there with my brother, and we're having a conversation. And we watch Alexandria at night for the last time. When I wrote the scene, I wrote it down and I published it. But when I rewrote the scene for my book, the editor said, "You know, Andre, there are too many children in this book. Maybe you're going to have to cut out your brother." And I said, "Okay, no problem. It's only a book, after all, it's not me." And so I removed my brother. So suddenly you have a version of the story where I am walking by myself, and I'm walking by myself to look at Alexandria for the last time at night. And as I'm walking by myself, the Egyptian fellow gives me a tameya, whatever it's called, and I eat it, and I'm sad that I'm leaving, and I say I'm going to remember this night for the rest of my life. Then I go back to Egypt after I wrote Out of Egypt, and I do the walk by myself. I'm already at that point 45 years old, I'm not 14, and I'm walking by myself, and I said, "You know, I don't remember walking here at all." And as I'm walking on the same street, it occurs to me that maybe that walk never occurred at all. And then comes the puzzling moment. I no longer know whether I took the walk with my brother, whether I took the walk alone, whether I even took the walk at all. I don't know. But on paper, it is very realistic to me. And when I want to feel good about saying goodbye to Alexandria, I go back to my book and I read the last few paragraphs and say, yes, that is certainly how it must have felt. So the imagination takes over everything. Thank you. I'm confessing that I'm lying and you're clapping at me. Thank you so much.
Andre, I think I read somewhere that you said that when you were writing Out of Egypt, you poured everything into the book. Is that correct? You poured all your memories into the book. You were writing from memory and you poured everything into the book. Have you found that when you went back, or when you reflect on it, or when you actually traveled back to Egypt, that there were other things that you remembered, or did Out of Egypt become sort of the beginning and the end of all your memories once you'd written it down?
Actually, there was a moment. I was sent to Egypt to write the way you were. I was sent to Egypt to write about going back to Egypt after writing Out of Egypt. So I went back to Egypt, and I stayed in the best hotel in the city because they were paying for it. I wasn't. And so I stayed there, and I decided it's nighttime. It's not that late. It's only 8:30, and it's dark, but the streets are filled with people. And I said, I'm going to take a walk and look at the familiar places of my childhood. And I took a walk. I walked. I saw this movie house, this place where I used to love the sandwiches, and I see another movie house, and I see a pastry shop, and I do the rounds of all the places that I knew. Well, number one, I didn't get lost at all. That would have been nice to get lost, because then you say, oh my God, time has happened, and now I've grown, and I'm distant, and things are unfamiliar that used to be very familiar. No, it's all entirely familiar. There was an old, big bell that the Russians had given to the Orthodox Church in Alexandria, and the bell was so heavy that they couldn't put it on the belfry because it would have collapsed the whole thing. So they left it sitting on the ground, and it was on the ground 30 years later. So nothing was unfamiliar. And as I did my long walk and came back to the hotel, I looked at my watch, and only 12 minutes had passed. In those 12 minutes, nothing unfamiliar had happened. All I noticed was that all the stores tended to sell shoes. because everything else had disappeared. The buildings were still the same, at least in the center of the city, but nothing was unfamiliar. I remembered everything. Nothing came to me as a new reminder because I'm back, and certainly something is going to come back. In fact, as I'm walking, I'm noticing that everything I said in my book is documented in the city itself. So I was a bit disappointed at my inability to remember new things.
Well, maybe it's just testimony to your ability to remember so much that you put in the book. So
Maybe.
yeah. Your book was very engaging. I read it when it first came out, and your family is extremely colorful. You're very critical of many of them, and you don't show them in I suppose, in the best light, but I guess you allow them to speak for themselves. But some people get quite a hard time in the book, I guess. But I think perhaps nobody gets as hard a time as the Egyptians in your book, who are largely absent. And you have some Egyptians in the book, but the Egyptians who are mostly there are largely the servants. And but nobody really else figures with any depth. And the poor servants of your family seem to be a rather disadvantaged lot who one doesn't have an arm, one doesn't have a leg, one doesn't have an eye, one has leprosy. I mean, they really seem to be, either your family was very charitable and took in all kinds of, difficultly situated people, but it seems, that's it. You paint quite a sort of disadvantaged picture of these people. And you've said in interviews, or I saw one interview where you said, Egyptians are the nicest people in the world, quote. I haven't found nicer people anywhere, unquote, something like that. But that doesn't come across very much in your book. Perhaps it's because the book is rather critical on the whole of the sort of theater of characters that are in the book. But you seem to come, many Egyptian readers have remarked to me that, well, he's why aren't there more Egyptians in the book, and why are he so hard on the Egyptians, and why are the only Egyptians who are in the book the servants? And if you bear with me, I just want to read a short part of a paragraph that I had questions about when I read it 20 years ago, and when I reread it now, I would still like to hear from you about. But you're talking about Egyptians' propensity, as you see it, for drinking fenugreek or helba,
Yes.
or what's known in India as meti leaves, which is also very common here to be used in cooking. And you say that this odor was so unmistakable and so overwhelming that one could immediately distinguish westernized Egyptians from those who affected Western habits, but whose minds, homes, and regiments were still steeped in the universe of helba, or meti. Even if an Egyptian had completely adopted Western ways, shed his native customs to become what my grandparents called an évolué, and wore a suit every day, learned table manners, kissed Mademoiselle's hands whenever he greeted them, and knew his wines, his cheeses, and the required number of La Fontaine fables by heart, the fact that his clothes gave off the slightest trace of that telltale scent would make one think twice about his professed inclination for the West, and suspect that not everyone in his household, himself included, had risen above the dark, sinister underside of Arab hygiene. So, what many readers have commented on is that, do you feel that had you used that paragraph to describe another ethnicity or another social class, that people would be correct in feeling affronted or spoken about in a sort of unfair way?
No. I think that you haven't mentioned what I say about Armenians. You mentioned there were Armenians, there were Greeks, there were Italians, there were French, there were Britons. Every single nationality I've taken down because I love doing that. I love criticizing people at their, basically in their most cliched sort of appearances, and I enjoy doing it. What I do to Armenians is terrible. And what I do to the Brits themselves is not nice at all. So I like to make fun of people. There's no point. And when you write about your family, I mean, how many of you, if you think about the family that you've grown up with, think that there were some individuals that you would want to kill if you could? Okay, I've seen hands being raised. There are people that you don't like in your own family. How many of you come from sane families? Please raise your hand in shame.
Do you, Claudia?
Nobody
Did
comes
you come
from a sane
family?
family. So, I take down every single individual and every single culture, every single ethnicity is taken down. However, after I take you down as an individual or a culture, I give you back your clothes after I undress you. I try to sort of resolve the conflict so that I am extremely nice to Egyptians in my book. And when I say goodbye to Abdu, I know very well that this is the last time I'm going to see him, and he weeps and holds me in his arms. And my mother is the same thing. The man who threatened to kill my mother in the marketplace because she haggled too much embraces her as she says goodbye to him, because this is the last time they're going to see each other. So yes, we did not have much contact with native Egyptians. But we were very, very close to them. And I think, just to take it to the next step, I spent more time in the kitchen, not doing my homework, listening to our servant, our cook servant, speak to the servant next door through the kitchen entrance, which basically bridged the two households, listening to every item of gossip that they had about their families, about the neighbors, about this and that, never discussing politics. But it was always amazing, a font of conversation that I was bewildered by, to the point that my grandmother would say, "What is he doing in the servants' quarters all the time? Avec les domestiques. Why is he with them all the time? He should be with us." I enjoyed the domestique more, but I will make fun of their culture, absolutely. And I will make fun of my grandmother. My God, she's in hell right now, tormented.
Your poor grandmothers. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Your poor grandmothers. Yeah.
One of my grandmother was a horrible human being.
And the other one was a saint.
The other one was a saint.
Yeah.
She was horrible too, by the way, but in contrast, she was a saint.
And she is called the saint.
She is called the saint. The other one was a princess.
Yes. Yes.
But it was wonderful the way they were rivals, because the same kind of thing happened in my family, the rivalry between the grandmothers. But talking about crazy families and why I feel I can't write about my family, but actually one of my aunts keeps telling me, "You have to write about the family." She's dead now, but she always said, "You have to write." Just because I write recipes doesn't mean I can write about the family. But she was saying, and put everything bad in, mainly because she had a lot of complaints of a sister. I mean, there were fights going on and rivalries, and she said, "You've got to write that." And when I was in LA with another aunt, I said that Germaine is telling me that I should be writing about the family. And she just said, "On ne lave pas son linge sale, on lave son linge sale en famille." It means you wash your dirty linen only in your family.
Only in the family. Yes.
But my mother thought of us as a perfect family, and her as a perfect mother. So we have this, that we can't betray anybody by showing that they were imperfect.
I did, but I'm sure they have questions.
Yes, I have many more questions for you, but I'm under strict instructions to allow a lot of time for questions. So I think we'll take it to the audience now, and we'll start with the lady in the blue jacket in the front.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for that. Professor, does your brother remember that walk?
Well, my brother is a very specific kind of individual that I admire and envy, because every time I say, "Do you remember XYZ?" No. Don't you feel homesick today on a particular day? Don't you want to go to the beach? No. There's absolutely no recall, no sort of desire to recombobulate the past and put it together again, fragmented as it is. And so I used to check with my mother a lot when she was alive, and she would say, yes, I remember that store. There was this ugly person inside there who always was, but she would give me the real flavor of the stupidity of the people in Alexandria is unmatched by anything you've ever seen. I mean, there were geniuses too, but the shallowness and the silliness is something that I can never forget.
Other questions? Yes. There's the young man here in the front.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I hail from the small town, and a few years back, my family shifted to Jaipur.
I'm
And
sorry, say, louder.
I used to hail, I hail from the small town, and a few years back, my family shifted to Jaipur. And sometimes I just feel this guilt that wish I could have spent more time in those streets. Wish I could have spent more time with my family over there, which lives over there. So do you ever feel that way?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that happens when you're in exile, let's call it exile, it's a convenient term, is that you're left with many strings of your life, what you might call sort of promised itineraries that have been severed, so that you feel that, oh my God, so and so, I could have learned more from such and such. I wish I had known so and so better. I wish I could have lived with them for a while. You have all these new things. For example, I had an aunt who lived in Zamalek, which is a part of Cairo, and so I remember visiting them only once. I was 3 years old, and I visited, and for me it was heaven, because I was away from my parents. Okay, and at the age of 3, that's already tells you what kind of family I came from. Okay, but it was absolutely heaven. And in retrospect, I've asked a friend of mine to look up at the old telephone directory of Cairo to find out where exactly they lived. Unfortunately, there are no telephone directories of Cairo in 1954. So at least they can't be found. So yes, I mean, these strings are just sort of there. And you find that nothing has any, if you believe in closure, you're a lucky person, nothing has ever any closure because it's all suspended. Everything has been provisional in the past, and in retrospect, it is unfinished.
I think we have some old telephone directories, Andre, and I know where to find more. So you just tell me what your aunt's name was, and I think we can find where she lived.
In a second.
Okay. There's a young lady in the front, the third row.
Hello, sir. So, you remind me of a character named Sindhi Oberoi in the novel The Foreigner by Arun Joshi. Because he was born in Uganda, and then he studied in the US, and then came back to India, and then he was lost, like, where shall we go this summer? So, and you have denied association with so many places. Is there any place or anything you actually feel attached to, which you will miss in the real sense?
I don't know. I feel that I find attachments in various cities, things that seem to matter to me and that I like. In other words, there's a part of Paris that I absolutely adore. Does that mean that I want to be buried in Paris? No. There's Rome. I love Rome. Do I want to be buried in Rome? Who's going to come and visit me in Rome? Okay. And basically, yes, you find attachments, but when you ask the question, where do I want to be buried? What you're really saying is, where shall I finally pitch my tent so that my life has meaning? And if you cannot come up with an answer, as I have not come up with an answer, then you know what displacement means. There is no home, because no part of the universe, on this planet at least, feels that this is where you want to belong for the next billion years. You see, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you're asking me a metaphorical question and you're getting a metaphorical answer.
The next question, this gentleman in the third row has had his hand up.
Could you tell me your feelings about the Alexandrian Quartet by Lawrence Durrell? They are my favorite books, and how have they aged, and how do you look upon them?
Do I like the book of
And
Lawrence Durrell?
what do you think about the Alexandrian Quartet? Lawrence Durrell's books about Alexandria, which have really made it the greatest city in history, really.
I think that I read the Alexandria Quartet in Rome a year after I was kicked out of Egypt. And I fell in love with the book. It gave me exactly the kind of pastel, sepia version of Alexandria that I needed to believe in, because it was not the Alexandria I knew. And I think that most people will tell you, this was not Alexandria, but it is actually very compelling. And it is I think it's a beautiful book. It's extremely well written. It should be taken a bit more seriously than it has been taken, because it is extremely beautiful and people don't know how to deal with that, but that's another question. And extremely well written. The point is that it's not the Alexandria I knew. I wish I knew that city, because I would have been glamorous.
Yes, I also find that I and nobody I knew thought that it was the Alexandria that they knew, except that I did know people, including one of my aunt, Edith, who thought she was Justine in the book. But I did get to know very well his ex-wife, Yvette Cohen, or Eve Cohen, in London, and we became great friends. And she was saying, well, he wrote it, it was his invention. But she also said, you know, Claudia, because I told her, you know, all these things that he wrote about the things that were happening in Egypt, like festivals and, you know, extraordinary folk things that were happening. And she said, well, he got it all out of William Lane. And
Edward Lane.
Edward Lane,
Yes,
sorry.
yes.
It was William Poole, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, Edward Lane in Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians. Yes. And I also used Edward Lane's book to find out about what food they ate in the 19th century. And so, you know, I think a lot of authors do this. They go and find their information, somebody that has written. But what I did find is, when I got to know Eve, I even went to Alexandria with her. By chance, I was there at the same time, and we were going to meet in the same hotel, but she left before I came, and I left it in the middle of the night because it was full of bed bugs and all that. But I did realize that her character was Justine in a way. Not only was it Justine, but her way of telling stories was a way that influenced Lawrence Durrell in his way that he wrote the book of the same story seen by many sides. Because every time I saw Eve, she would tell me a story about something that actually happened in her family or anywhere. And then sometimes a few days later or a year later, she would tell me, and I said, is that the aunt who did this and that? She wasn't like that at all. You know, she's the opposite of that. So she really gave me a different story about every person that was in her life. And so I just thought, well, this is something that rings a bell about the way Lawrence Durrell wrote his quartet, where for 3 times it's seen from a different perspective.
Yes. Each book is from a different perspective. Yes. I think there was a question at the back. Yes, the young man with the glasses. Yes, waving his arm. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah. Put your hand up. There. No. There. No. Stop. Come back. Yes.
Right. Hi, my name is Biprojit, and it was a very fascinating session.
Could you speak up, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Biprojit, and it was a fascinating session listening to all of you. I'm just curious. I want to know something. In both of the memories that Claudia and André you talked about, there were some things that came up, and those were windows and water bodies. And even Cavafy speaks of windows in The God Abandons Anton. I'm just curious, why are you associating windows and the sea? I understand the sea probably, but why are you associating windows so much with the city that you have left? So,
I think why
Let me take it. It's easier. Are you familiar with the painter? Where are you? I don't see. Oh, there you are. Okay. Are you familiar with the painter Raoul Dufy? Well, Raoul Dufy went to Nice, and he's constantly painting Nice. And when the first time I saw a particular painting by Raoul Dufy, I said, "This is me. This is my world. This is exactly the universe I come from." The French window is open. There's a balcony banister, and right beyond the banister, and you can see through the balusters of the banister, you can see the blue. That is my world. That is my excitement. This painting is, I don't care, it's a good painting. It's not a Rembrandt, not a Caravaggio. I don't care. If I could steal it, I would. Okay, it's a beautiful painting for me, and it speaks to me because it concretizes on the screen itself something that I've been looking for all my life. A view of the sea from a balcony when I was a child, excited that within a few minutes we were going to take our towels, our sandals, and go to the beach. And that kind of immediacy that you have in Raoul Dufy evokes for me something that's very powerful. So yes, windows, but you have to realize that windows are also an inhibitor. A window means that you're not there. It means that you have to cross the street. You have to cross, of course, the very painting itself, the sketch of the painting, so that there's distance between what you want and what you can get, and you may never get it. So it plays both ways. So windows are inhibitors and at the same time enablers of what it is that you want.
For me, the windows were the windows of the car, because we arrived by car on the desert road. And the desert road, I think, was only 2 hours, but to us it seemed like 10 hours when we were children. And we went there, well, by the time we arrived, we were singing every kind of song, from It's a Long Way to Tipperary to Alouette and Alouette. But when we arrived, suddenly we saw the sea. But this excitement of us, of seeing the sea, was to me something also that I remember. And for me, the sea is a huge, huge attraction, wherever it is, as well, of an excitement that you feel. I always wish I was living by the sea, but I never did. Except
I think certainly for most Alexandrians and for Cairenes who spent so much time by the sea every summer, it really becomes a very integral part of your experience, and it becomes very difficult to live away from the sea for long periods of time. At least I certainly feel that way. So I don't know about you, Andre, but I certainly feel that way.
No, you look for the sea anywhere you go, and as soon as you spot it, you just say, this. You know that there's a word I invented. It comes from ancient Greek. And I checked with a Greek scholar who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I said, does that make sense? He said, absolutely, totally true. Is that an Alexandrian, and I'm sure a Cairene too, an Alexandrian has a sense, even before you hear the sea and before you smell the sea, before anything, you already say, I know there's a body of water around here. I can sense. And most of us have that sense. But when you're a child, you have it right away. You know, even before you open your eyes in the morning, I bet you I can tell already that the water is going to be slick. There's not going to be a single ripple. It's going to be fantastic to swim in it. So you know what the sea is like, and you anticipate the presence of a sea. So sometimes I'll be in a different city altogether, and I'll say, I know there's a body of water nearby. I can tell. Something tells me that. And sure enough, it's a lake, but it's okay.
Yeah, but also the light and the sun the kind of light that you have in the Mediterranean is different to the light next to another sea, for instance, in Britain or something.
That's true.
That's very true, yes. We have exactly 1 minute. We have time for one last question. There's a young man in the back with his hand up. Yeah. This is our last question. Please keep it very short.
Hi, the question to the sir is like, you told us that in your book, you remove your brother. So I want to know what was the feeling of your brother when he knew about that thing?
Ask him. No, he was okay with it. I think his wife was not very happy.
Okay. André Aciman and Claudia Roden, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you all.
And thank you for being such a great audience.
Thank you very much.